The courtroom was ready to decide a fate before the truth was ever heard. A decorated seal stood accused. A service dog lay quietly at his feet, labeled dangerous, uncontrollable, expendable. Everyone believed the story was simple. A dog attacked, a man failed, a life was lost. But when the judge allowed one final video to play, something changed. The silence that followed was not confusion, it was recognition. Because what the video revealed was not an act of violence, but a moment of sacrifice. A split second where loyalty moved faster than fear. A moment where a life was taken not by cruelty, but saved by courage. And in that silence, many realized the truth had been there all along, waiting for the right moment to be seen. Morning in Phoenix, Arizona was dry and quiet, the kind of winter morning where the sun rose without warmth and the air carried dust instead of mist. The federal courthouse stood firm at the center of the city, its stone exterior unchanged by decades of verdicts passed within. By the time Matthew Hayes reached the front steps, the plaza was already alive with restrained movement. Lawyers, clerks, security officers, people who understood that this building was not a place for emotion, only consequence. Matthew Hayes was 43, tall and solidly built, moving with the controlled economy of someone who had spent most of his life under observation. His navy suit was plain and carefully pressed, chosen to draw no attention. The cut of it could not hide the strength in his shoulders or the discipline in his posture. His hair was cropped short, streaked with gray at the temples, and his face bore the quiet wear of long service, sun-lined skin, tired eyes, and an expression trained to remain neutral regardless of pressure. Matthew did not look like a man seeking defense. He looked like a man prepared to stand still while judgment passed over him. At his side walked Ranger. The German shepherd was 7 years old, large and powerfully built, with a thick coat of black and sable fur that caught light unevenly as he moved. His ears were upright, alert without tension, and his amber-brown eyes observed the world calmly, without haste or fear. A faint dusting of gray around his muzzle softened his expression, giving him a quiet gravity. Ranger wore only a service collar, no vest or markings. The leash between him and Matthew hung loose. He did not need correction. He matched Matthew's pace naturally, stopping when Matthew stopped, sitting when Matthew paused, as if the movement itself were instinctive. People noticed the dog before they noticed the man. Heads turned briefly, curiosity flickering and fading. No one spoke. Ranger did not react. He moved forward with steady confidence, unbothered by attention, unshaken by the unfamiliar environment. To those watching, he was a contradiction, a working animal in a place defined by words and procedure. At the base of the courthouse steps, Matthew stopped. Ranger sat immediately at his left side. Matthew adjusted his grip on the leash and rested his hand briefly on the dog's shoulder, a small habitual gesture. Ranger did not look up. He remained still, grounded, present. Whatever lay ahead, he would not move unless asked, or unless necessary. Inside, the courthouse air was cool and neutral, stripped of scent and warmth. The hallways muted sound, absorbing footsteps and voices alike. Security officers waved them through after brief inspection. Ranger passed without incident, his behavior controlled and professional. Matthew felt the shift as they crossed into the courtroom itself, a larger space paneled in dark wood, heavy with formality. The judge's bench dominated the far wall, the American flag standing motionless behind it. Rows of seats faced forward, some already filled. Matthew guided Ranger to a seat near the defense table. Ranger lay down beside him, his body close, his breathing slow and steady. He did not scan the room unnecessarily. He did not fidget. His calm was complete, learned through years of discipline and trust. Across the aisle, the prosecutor took his place. Thomas Green was in his late 40s, tall and sharply dressed, with neatly combed hair and a posture that reflected his belief in systems and structure. His gaze flicked briefly to Ranger, assessing rather than emotional, before returning to his notes. To Green, this case was simple in principle. A handler was responsible for his K9. If control failed, responsibility followed. Near the back of the room sat a woman named Sarah Collins. In her late 30s, tall and slender, she wore a gray coat and kept her dark hair pulled back neatly. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap. Sarah was not part of the proceedings officially. She had come because the case unsettled her. Years earlier, an unexpected act of violence had altered the way she viewed authority and accountability. Since then, she paid attention when stories surfaced that questioned who bore blame when moments moved too fast for clean decisions. She watched Ranger now with careful focus, her expression unreadable. An older man, Robert Hale, took a seat closer to the aisle. A retired federal marshal, Hale carried himself with deliberate slowness. His hair was white and thin, his face deeply lined, his eyes observant and tired. He had seen enough cases to know that truth rarely arrived whole. He gave Matthew a brief nod, acknowledgment without promise. As the bailiff called the courtroom to order, Matthew remained still. When the judge entered, everyone rose. Ranger stood smoothly beside Matthew, then sat again when Matthew did. The judge, an older woman with silver hair and a composed expression, surveyed the room briefly before taking her seat. Her eyes passed over Matthew and Ranger without reaction. The clerk began to read the case. The language was formal and restrained, but the meaning was sharp. Matthew Hayes, a Navy SEAL, was accused of failing to maintain control over his K9 during a counterterrorism operation. The result, according to the charge, was excessive force, a breach of protocol, a failure of command. The consequences were severe. If the accusation stood, Ranger would be removed from active service permanently. His career ended not in honor, but in censure. Matthew's own record, years of service, discipline, and sacrifice, would be reduced to a cautionary example. There would be no context offered here, no acknowledgement of complexity. Only the question of control. Matthew listened without reaction. His hand rested lightly on Ranger's shoulder. Ranger remained calm, head on his paws, eyes open. He did not understand the words, but he sensed the tension. He stayed close. When the judge addressed Matthew and asked for his plea, he stood. Ranger did not move. Matthew's voice was steady, stripped of excess. He entered a plea of not guilty. The words settled into the room. Outside, Phoenix continued its mourning. Inside, the courtroom had opened, and with it, the challenge to a man's honor and a dog's right to have served. The warehouse stood less than a mile from the border, a long concrete structure half buried in dust, its metal walls warped by heat and age. The sun was already dropping, the sky washed pale and thin, offering just enough light to hide what waited inside. Matthew Hayes remembered how quiet it was, not the calm kind of quiet, but the kind that presses against the ears, demanding attention. The team moved in formation across the gravel, boots crunching softly, weapons lowered but ready. There were 6 of them, spaced evenly, each step measured. Hayes stayed slightly behind the point man, his attention split between the structure ahead and the presence at his left. Ranger moved with him. At 7 years old, the German Shepherd no longer surged forward the way younger dogs did. His pace was controlled, deliberate. His black and sable coat was already dusted gray near the paws, his breathing steady, almost deceptively calm. His ears shifted subtly as he sampled the air, not searching wildly, but filtering. Hayes trusted that calm more than any sensor on his vest. They were 20 meters from the main door when Ranger slowed. Not stopped. Slowed. Hayes caught it instantly. Ranger's head dipped, then lifted. His nostrils flared once, sharply. The dog's gait changed, weight shifting forward, muscles tightening beneath the fur. His tail froze mid-swing. That was the first sign. Hayes raised his fist. The team halted. No one spoke. No one questioned it. They had trained together long enough to know when a pause mattered. Hayes crouched slightly, his hand brushing Ranger's shoulder. Ranger did not look at him. His eyes were fixed on the door. The smell reached Hayes a second later, faint and wrong. Not strong enough for certainty, but enough to unsettle. It didn't belong to dust or rust or oil. It carried a sharpness that prickled the back of the throat. Ranger stepped forward once, slow and careful, nose lowering toward the ground near the doorframe. He inhaled deeply. His ears snapped forward. This time Hayes did not hesitate. He had seen this posture before. Ranger had been trained to detect explosive compounds, ignition residue, and the subtle combinations that signaled something assembled, not stored. This was not curiosity. This was confirmation. Hayes signaled again, tighter now. Full stop. Increased distance. One of the operators, Cole Dawson, shifted behind him. Dawson was younger, lean, his movements restless even when still. His eyes flicked between Ranger and the door. He didn't speak, but his tension showed. Hayes understood it. Intelligence had labeled the site low risk. No explosives reported, no heavy resistance expected. Ranger disagreed. The dog's breathing changed, faster now, controlled but urgent. His head lifted sharply toward the gap beneath the metal door. His body angled slightly, blocking Hayes's path without touching him. Hayes felt his pulse climb. Inside the warehouse something moved. Not footsteps, not voices. A metallic click. It was faint, almost lost to distance, but Ranger reacted instantly. His muscles locked, his ears pinned forward. Every line of his body pointed toward the sound. Hayes felt the certainty settle in his chest like a weight. That sound was a trigger. Ranger did not bark. He did not lunge. He held, coiled tight, as if waiting for the world to tip. Hayes knew then, with absolute clarity, that the danger was real and immediate. Someone inside was armed not with a weapon meant to aim, but one meant to detonate. This was not about confrontation. This was about seconds. Hayes signaled readiness, not retreat, not breach. Just readiness. The team adjusted, spreading slightly, increasing distance from the entrance. Sweat slid down Hayes's spine beneath his armor, but his hands were steady. His eyes never left Ranger. Ranger took one deliberate step forward, nose lifting again. The smell was stronger now, chemical, sharp, unmistakable. This was the moment everything narrowed. There was no room for debate, no time for confirmation from command. Ranger had detected the danger before any human sense could have caught it. He had done exactly what he was trained to do. Hayes placed his hand firmly on Ranger's shoulder, grounding himself in the reality of the signal. Ranger did not flinch. He did not look back. He was focused on the threat beyond the wall, on the unseen hand moving closer to ignition. Whatever happened next would happen because Ranger had been right first. The warehouse remained silent, the border stretching endlessly beyond it, indifferent to the tension gathering at its edge. Hayes felt the shift in the air, the invisible line crossed not by action, but by awareness. The first sign had been given. The moment stretched thin, fragile as glass. Inside the warehouse, the suspect bent forward, shoulders rounding, his right hand disappearing beneath the loose fabric of his jacket. It was not a dramatic movement. It was small, practiced, efficient. The kind of movement that ended conversations, ended lives. Matthew Hayes saw it at the same time Ranger did. There was no command, no shout, no warning. Ranger moved. The German shepherd exploded forward in a blur of muscle and intent, paws striking concrete with violent certainty. At 7 years old, Ranger's body no longer wasted motion. Every ounce of his strength was directed toward one purpose. His ears flattened, his eyes locked on the suspect's center mass, not with rage, but with absolute focus. This was not an attack born of aggression. This was intervention. Hayes did not reach for the leash. He did not call Ranger back. He did nothing at all, because this was not loss of control. This was the moment Ranger had been trained for, drilled into muscle memory and instinct until action replaced hesitation. Hayes understood the difference, even as time collapsed into fragments. The suspect's fingers brushed metal. Ranger hit him low and hard. The impact drove the man backward, his balance breaking as his knees buckled. The device slipped from his grasp, skidding across the concrete floor, its casing scraping loudly in the sudden chaos. Ranger followed through, pinning the suspect with his weight, teeth locking onto fabric and flesh where movement mattered most. The man cried out, a sharp, broken sound that echoed through the warehouse. The team surged forward instantly. Cole Dawson was first through the doorway, his lean frame moving fast, eyes wide with adrenaline. Dawson had always been quick, too quick at times, but here speed saved lives. He kicked the device away with his boot, sending it spinning toward the far wall. Another operator followed, heavier built, broader shouldered, his movements slower but decisive. His name was Aaron Pike, the team leader, a man whose calm had been forged by decades of responsibility. Pike dropped to one knee beside the suspect, securing his arms with practiced force. Ranger did not release. His body trembled with effort, breath coming fast now, controlled but intense. His grip was firm, measured, trained to restrain rather than destroy. Hayes stepped forward at last, placing a hand on Ranger's flank. He felt the heat beneath the fur, the power still coiled there. "Hold," Hayes said quietly. Ranger adjusted, easing pressure without letting go. His eyes flicked up to Hayes for a fraction of a second, then returned to the suspect. That glance was not a question. It was confirmation. The device lay still against the wall. No detonation followed. Silence rushed in, heavy and unreal. Hayes exhaled for the first time in what felt like minutes. The air inside the warehouse smelled sharper now, chemicals mixed with sweat and fear. His hands remained steady, though his pulse thundered in his ears. He crouched beside Ranger, keeping his touch firm and grounding. "This is over," Hayes said, not to the suspect, but to Ranger. Ranger released his grip slowly, carefully, stepping back on command. He remained between Hayes and the suspect, his posture alert, ready to re-engage if necessary. His mouth hung open slightly, tongue dark with heat, chest rising and falling fast. He was not frantic. He was vigilant. Pike secured the suspect fully, binding his hands behind his back. Pike's face was grim, lined with concentration rather than shock. He glanced once at the device, then at Ranger, then at Hayes. "That was close," Pike said. Hayes nodded. Close was not strong enough, but it would do. Dawson crouched near the wall, eyes fixed on the device as if it might still decide to betray them. His hands shook slightly as he ran a quick visual assessment, though explosives were not his specialty. He swallowed hard. "That thing was live," Dawson said. "I heard it." Hayes had heard it too. Ranger shifted beside him, muscles finally beginning to loosen as the immediate threat faded. Hayes ran his hand along Ranger's neck, fingers sinking into the thick fur. He felt the dog's tension drain gradually, like water released from a clenched fist. This was the moment that would later be replayed in pieces. The leap, the contact, the suspect falling. Stripped of context, it would look violent, uncontrolled, excessive. Hayes knew that even now, standing in the aftermath, with the device silent and lives intact. Ranger sat obedient and calm as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. Hayes stood slowly, scanning the warehouse. The space was larger than it had seemed from outside, cluttered with crates and abandoned machinery. Dust hung in the air, disturbed by movement. The border beyond the far wall remained invisible, irrelevant. Everything that mattered had happened here. In seconds. Pike gave the signal to clear the rest of the structure. Operators moved out, methodical again, adrenaline receding into routine. Hayes stayed with Ranger, watching the dog's breathing slow, watching his posture return to neutral. Ranger had not waited for permission. He had not needed it. Hayes knew that. He also knew how difficult that truth would be to explain to people who measured action in policies rather than moments. He knelt beside Ranger, resting his forehead briefly against the dog's broad skull. It was a quiet gesture, unseen by the others. "You did right," Hayes murmured. Ranger's ears flicked. He leaned subtly into the contact, then sat upright again, ready for whatever came next. The suspect was hauled to his feet, groaning, eyes wild with pain and fear. He stared at Ranger with something like disbelief. He had not expected the interruption. He had not expected to be stopped by an animal acting faster than thought. Hayes met the man's gaze briefly, then looked away. There was no satisfaction there, only the heavy awareness of how close the line had been, how narrow the margin. As the team secured the warehouse, Hayes remained still, replaying the moment in his mind. The bend of the suspect's back, the hand moving, Ranger launching forward without hesitation, no command given, none required. This was the reflex that saved lives, and this was the reflex that would later be questioned. When the all-clear finally came, the tension ebbed completely, leaving behind the familiar hollow calm that followed near catastrophe. Ranger stood when Hayes stood, moving at his side once more, composed and alert. The threat had been stopped. The explosion had been denied. The cost, Hayes knew, would come later. The courtroom was quieter than Matthew Hayes remembered. Not silent, but muted, as if the air itself had learned restraint. Light filtered through the high windows of the federal courthouse in Arizona, pale and even, casting no shadows sharp enough to hide behind. Hayes sat at the defense table, spine straight, hands resting loosely together. Ranger lay at his feet, head on his paws, eyes open, alert, calm. The German shepherd's black and sable coat contrasted sharply with the polished wood floor beneath him. At 7 years old, Ranger carried himself with the composed patience of an animal that had learned to wait without anxiety. Across the room, the prosecutor stood. Thomas Green was a tall man, in his late 40s, clean-shaven, his dark suit immaculate, his posture rigid with discipline. His hair was neatly combed back, his expression controlled, almost severe. Green was not cruel by nature. He believed in order, in rules that kept chaos from spreading. To him, responsibility was something that had to be clearly assigned, even if clarity came at a cost. He faced the jury with confidence, his voice measured as he introduced the next piece of evidence. The screen at the front of the courtroom flickered to life. Hayes felt the shift before the video even began. Ranger lifted his head slightly, ears angling forward. He did not move beyond that. He did not whine or tense. But Hayes felt the weight settle in his chest, the same familiar pressure that had followed him since the mission ended. The footage began abruptly, grainy, narrow in scope, tinted with the dull green of low-light recording. The perspective was close, unstable, the viewpoint of a body-worn camera. The image showed the interior of the warehouse, cluttered and dim. Then, suddenly, Ranger appeared in frame, lunging forward with explosive force. The moment was fast, violent, stripped of context. The suspect fell backward. The image jolted. The sound spiked. Then the clip ended. No let-up, no pause, no explanation. A murmur rippled through the courtroom, subtle, restrained, but unmistakable. Hayes did not move. He did not look at the jury. He kept his eyes forward, jaw tight. At his feet, Ranger rested his chin back on the floor, unbothered by the attention, unaware of the interpretation unfolding above him. Green let the silence linger. "What you have just seen," he said, turning slightly toward the jury, "is the moment control was lost." Hayes felt the words land, heavy and deliberate. Green continued, his tone calm, authoritative. He spoke of protocol, of engagement rules, of the expectation that a handler maintains absolute control over a canine at all times. He replayed the clip, this time slowing it down, frame by frame. Ranger's leap filled the screen. Teeth, impact, the suspect's body hitting the floor. There was no visible threat at the time of contact, Green said. No weapon raised, no confirmed device in hand, only a dog unleashed. The words were precise, effective. Hayes clenched his hands briefly, then forced them to relax. He knew better than to react. Reaction could be mistaken for guilt. Instead, he looked down at Ranger. The dog's breathing was slow, steady. His eyes met Hayes's for a brief moment, unreadable, trusting. Hayes looked away before the connection could betray him. At the back of the courtroom, Sarah Collins watched the screen with a tightening expression. Sarah was in her late 30s, tall and slender, her dark hair pulled back into a simple knot at the base of her neck. She wore a modest blouse beneath a gray jacket, her posture composed but tense. Sarah had learned to hold herself that way years earlier, after an unexpected act of violence had altered her understanding of safety. Since then, she listened closely when narratives felt incomplete. As the video ended again, she felt that familiar discomfort rise. Something was missing. She could not say what, only that the story felt unfinished. Green moved on. He gestured toward Ranger, lying quietly at Hayes's feet. "This animal," he said, "acted without restraint, and when such an action occurs under the supervision of a trained operator, responsibility lies with the human, not the animal." Ranger did not stir. Hayes felt a flicker of anger then, sharp and brief, not at the accusation itself, but at the reduction. Ranger was being transformed into a single frozen moment on a screen, stripped of training, stripped of context, stripped of purpose. The defense attorney, Michael Reed, rose slowly from his seat. Reed was a man in his early 50s, broad-shouldered but slightly stooped, his hair thinning at the crown, his face marked by lines earned through years of careful listening rather than loud argument. He adjusted his glasses and faced the judge, then the jury. Reed was not dramatic. He favored patience over spectacle. "With the court's permission," Reed said evenly, "I would like to note that the video presented is incomplete." Green's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "The footage reflects the relevant moment," Green replied, "the moment of force." Reed nodded once, acknowledging the point without accepting it. He returned to his seat, choosing not to argue further for now. Hayes understood the decision. This was not the time. Not yet. The judge watched the exchange closely, her expression neutral, unreadable. She had seen evidence presented in fragments before. She knew how stories could be shaped by omission as much as inclusion. The clip was played once more, this time without sound. In silence, the image felt even harsher. Ranger's movement looked sudden, unprovoked. The suspect's fall seemed almost incidental, as if he were merely in the wrong place at the wrong time. At his feet, Ranger shifted slightly, then stilled again. Hayes felt the familiar pull of memory press against his restraint. He remembered the smell, the sound, the certainty. None of it existed on that screen. When the prosecutor finally sat, the courtroom remained quiet. The damage had been done. A narrative had been offered, clean and alarming, easy to grasp. Hayes remained seated, his expression unchanged. He knew this version of events would linger. He knew it would follow Ranger beyond this room if left unchallenged. At the back, Sarah lowered her gaze, her hands tightening together. She did not know Hayes. She did not know Ranger. But she knew when truth had been bent by silence. The judge called for a brief recess. As people rose and shifted, Ranger stood smoothly beside Hayes, matching him step for step as they prepared to leave the courtroom. Hayes paused for a moment, looking once more at the blank screen at the front of the room. This was the story now. A story missing its beginning. The courthouse emptied slowly after the recess. voices fading into the corridors like echoes reluctant to leave. Matthew Hayes walked out with Ranger at his side, the dog's steps soft and measured against the polished floor. Outside, the Arizona sky had shifted toward late afternoon, the light turning flatter, harsher, as if the day itself had grown less forgiving. Hayes felt the weight of the courtroom linger on him, heavier now than when he had entered. The images from the screen would not loosen their grip easily. Ranger sensed the change. He stayed closer than usual, his shoulder brushing Hayes's leg with each step. The German shepherd's ears were relaxed, but his eyes watched Hayes more than the world around them. At 7 years old, Ranger had learned to read silences as carefully as scents. He did not need words to know something had unsettled his handler. They returned to a modest government housing unit on the outskirts of the city, a place Hayes had been assigned months earlier. The building was plain, its walls bare, its rooms functional rather than welcoming. Hayes preferred it that way. Distraction had never served him well. Ranger moved through the space with familiarity, circling once before settling near the door, his posture alert but calm. Hayes did not turn on the lights right away. He stood near the window, watching the sun sink behind distant buildings, replaying the courtroom footage in his mind. The moment Ranger appeared on screen, the sudden leap, the way the clip ended before explanation could exist. It was not what the video showed that disturbed him most. It was what it refused to show. The video was wrong, not fabricated, not entirely false, just incomplete in a way that bent truth without breaking it. Hayes sat at the small table near the window, resting his elbows on the surface, his hands clasped loosely together. He had spent years in intelligence operations where information was never offered whole. Pieces were arranged. Gaps were intentional. He had learned to spot those gaps early, to feel when something essential had been removed. The body cam footage shown in court carried the signature of omission, the abrupt start, the absence of audio cues before the movement, the missing seconds where context should have lived. Those seconds mattered more than anything else. Ranger rose quietly and walked over, resting his head against Hayes's knee. The dog's fur was warm beneath his hand, solid, grounding. Hayes let his fingers curl into the thick coat at Ranger's neck, breathing more evenly as the day's tension eased slightly. "Something's missing," Hayes said softly. Ranger did not respond, but he did not move away. That night, Hayes did not sleep. He lay on the narrow bed, staring at the ceiling as the hours passed, the room lit faintly by the city beyond the window. His mind returned again and again to the warehouse. Not the chaos, not the impact, but the moments before. The smell, the sound, the certainty. None of that had appeared on the screen. By morning, his doubt had sharpened into resolve. Hayes contacted an old acquaintance, not as a defendant, but as a professional. Lucas Bennett answered on the third ring. Bennett was a systems technician in his late 30s, thin to the point of fragility, with pale skin and wire-frame glasses that always seemed slightly crooked. He had the nervous energy of someone who lived inside machines more comfortably than among people. Years earlier, Bennett and Hayes had crossed paths during a joint operation, Bennett responsible for maintaining data integrity under extreme conditions. He had been competent, precise, and deeply uncomfortable with authority when it demanded shortcuts. "Matt," Bennett said, surprise threading his voice. "I saw the case." Hayes did not waste time. He explained his concern calmly, professionally. He did not accuse. He did not demand. He asked a single question. "Is that the full file?" There was a pause on the line. "A long one?" "I can't say," Bennett replied finally. His voice carried strain now. "But what they show doesn't look complete." That was enough. Over the next days, Hayes worked quietly, methodically. He did not hack systems or bypass security. He didn't need to. He followed trails the way he always had, not through doors, but through habits. Files were copied. Logs were mirrored. Backup protocols were reviewed. Hayes knew how data moved through command structures. He knew where redundancy lived and where truth often hid when public versions were sanitized. Ranger stayed close through it all. He lay beneath the table as Hayes worked, occasionally lifting his head when Hayes shifted position. The dog's presence was constant, steady, as if anchoring Hayes to the simple reality beneath the layers of analysis. At one point, Hayes paused, rubbing his eyes as fatigue pressed down hard. Ranger stood and nudged him gently with his nose, a soft insistence that broke the tension. Hayes let out a brief breath that almost resembled a laugh. "Still watching out for me," he murmured. By the third night, the pattern became undeniable. Time-stamped discrepancies, audio files truncated earlier than standard protocol. A secondary data stream flagged as archived, but never accessed. It was subtle work, the kind designed to pass unnoticed unless someone knew exactly where to look. Hayes understood then what had happened. The footage had been shaped to protect decisions made far above the warehouse floor. If the full sequence surfaced, questions would follow, not just about Ranger, but about planning, intelligence assessment, and authorization. The easiest solution had been to narrow the frame until responsibility fell cleanly on a handler and a dog. The realization settled heavily in Hayes's chest. He had accepted responsibility for dangerous decisions his entire career. What he could not accept was responsibility for a lie. Sarah Collins appeared again in his thoughts, though he had never spoken to her. He remembered her face in the courtroom, the way she had leaned forward slightly when the clip ended, as if searching for something unseen. She struck him as someone who listened carefully, someone shaped by an event that had taught her how quickly truth could be misplaced. Hayes wondered if she felt the same unease now. On the fourth night, Hayes closed his laptop and sat back, exhaustion finally catching up with him. The room was quiet except for Ranger's slow breathing. Outside, traffic hummed distantly, indifferent to the war being waged in silence. Hayes had not yet recovered the full truth. But he knew where it was buried, and he knew it had been buried on purpose. This was no longer just about clearing his name or restoring Ranger's honor. It was about exposing a choice that had been made when accountability felt inconvenient. Ranger lifted his head, watching Hayes closely. "We're not done," Hayes said quietly. Ranger stood, tail giving a single slow wag, his expression steady and ready. The doubt that had stolen Hayes's sleep had transformed into something sharper, more dangerous. Certainty. And certainty, Hayes knew, demanded action. Night settled over the city without ceremony. The apartment assigned to Matthew Hayes was quiet, stripped of anything unnecessary. A table, a chair, a single lamp casting a narrow circle of light. Hayes sat within that circle, sleeves rolled to his forearms, his posture steady despite the fatigue pulling at his shoulders. Ranger lay beside him, stretched along the floor, his black and sable coat blending into shadow, his breathing slow and regular. At 7 years old, Ranger no longer slept deeply when Hayes was awake. He rested lightly, ready. Hayes had reached the point where instinct became method. The doubt that had followed him since the courtroom no longer drifted. It pointed. Years in intelligence had taught him how omissions left fingerprints, not marks of chaos, but of order applied too deliberately. The video shown in court had been shaped, not altered beyond recognition, but narrowed, trimmed, and directed. Hayes did not chase the obvious path. Obvious paths were watched. He worked instead through the quiet layers of redundancy that systems depended on but rarely revisited. Archive logs, backup rotations, secondary mirrors meant to protect data from loss, not scrutiny. Hayes moved slowly, letting time work with him rather than against him. Every step followed procedure. Nothing forced, nothing broken. Ranger shifted once, lifting his head briefly as Hayes leaned closer to the screen. The dog's ears angled forward, then relaxed again. He settled back down, trusting the calm in Hayes's movements. The file appeared without ceremony. No alarms, no resistance. Just a line of text that did not belong where it had been placed. Hayes stopped moving. He stared at the screen, not reading ahead, not opening anything yet. Years earlier, he had learned that the moment before confirmation mattered. It was where discipline was tested. He breathed once, slow and measured, then secured the environment before proceeding. He disconnected external access. He verified integrity. He confirmed timestamps. This was the original archive. Uncut. Hayes did not play it. Not yet. He closed the file and sat back, hands resting flat on the table. He felt no surge of triumph, no rush of relief, only the quiet certainty that the question troubling him had been answered. The truth had existed all along. It had simply been moved aside. Ranger stood and walked closer, resting his head against Hayes's knee. Hayes placed a hand on the dog's neck, fingers sinking into familiar warmth. Ranger's presence steadied him, as it always had. Hayes did not need to see the footage to know what it contained. He already knew the sequence. He had lived it. What mattered now was not validation. It was placement. Hayes encrypted the file with care, treating it less like evidence and more like responsibility. Each layer of security was deliberate, each check repeated. When he finished, he sat still again, listening to the quiet hum of the room. There was only one place the file should go. Michael Reed. The defense attorney had not reacted theatrically in court. He had watched, listened, filed details away. Reed was a man in his early 50s, broad through the shoulders, his posture softened by years of patience rather than weakness. His hair had begun to thin, his expression often neutral, but his eyes missed very little. He believed in preparation more than persuasion. Hayes trusted that. He sent a brief message, no explanation, no attachment, just a request to receive something securely and immediately. The response came quickly. Hayes initiated the transfer without ceremony. The progress bar moved steadily across the screen, silent and unremarkable. No one else knew what was moving through the system at that moment. No announcement marked its passage. The truth traveled quietly, as it often did. When the transfer completed, Hayes closed the laptop. The room felt different then, not lighter, not easier, just settled. The weight he had been carrying had shifted from his hands to the path ahead. Ranger exhaled deeply, rolling onto his side for the first time that night. The dog's trust was absolute. He had acted without hesitation. He had needed no reassurance afterward. He had no need for justice. That was a human burden. Hayes stood and crossed to the window, looking out at the city. Lights glimmered in distant buildings, lives moving forward unaware. Somewhere else in that city, Michael Reed would soon open a file that changed the shape of the case. Hayes did not imagine Reed's reaction. He did not need to. The footage would speak on its own when the time came. In another apartment not far away, Sarah Collins sat alone at her table, hands wrapped around a mug she had forgotten to drink from. Sarah was tall and slender, her movements careful, her posture composed despite the tension that lived beneath her skin. Years earlier, she had learned what it felt like to watch truth arrive too late. Since then, she listened closely when stories felt incomplete. The courtroom footage had unsettled her. She could not explain why, only that something essential had been missing. Hayes did not know her name, but the truth now moving toward the courtroom would reach people like her. Ranger rose and joined Hayes at the window, sitting close, his shoulder touching Hayes's leg. Hayes rested his hand on the dog's back, feeling the steady strength beneath the fur. "It's where it belongs now," Hayes said quietly. Ranger did not respond. He did not need to. The truth had been found, and it had been sent. The courtroom settled into a silence that felt deliberate, almost ceremonial. It was the kind of quiet that arrived when people sensed a shift before they could name it. Sunlight filtered through the high windows of the federal courthouse, pale and even, illuminating dust motes drifting slowly above polished wood benches. Matthew Hayes sat upright at the defense table, hands folded loosely, his expression controlled. Ranger lay beside him, head resting on his paws, body relaxed, eyes half open. The German shepherd appeared indifferent to the weight of the room, unaware that his future was about to be decided by images rather than instinct. The judge nodded once toward the defense. Michael Reed stood. Reed was not a dramatic man. In his early 50s, broad through the shoulders, his posture carried the patience of someone who trusted preparation over performance. His thinning hair and lined face gave him the look of a man shaped by listening rather than arguing. He adjusted his stance, waited until the room was fully attentive, and spoke evenly. The defense would like to present the original body cam footage associated with the incident. Across the aisle, Thomas Green stiffened but did not rise. His confidence remained, though it no longer filled the space the way it had before. The screen at the front of the courtroom came to life. This time, the footage began earlier. The image was wider, steadier. The timestamp ran uninterrupted. The approach to the warehouse unfolded slowly, methodically. Sound carried clearly now. Gravel beneath boots, controlled breathing, the quiet discipline of a trained team moving with purpose. Ranger entered the frame at Hayes's side. The jury watched closely as the dog's behavior changed. Not suddenly, not violently, but unmistakably. Ranger slowed. His head dipped, then lifted. His ears angled forward. His tail stilled. The moment lingered just long enough for recognition to form. Hayes felt the room lean inward. A faint metallic sound followed, barely audible, but sharp enough to matter. On screen, the suspect shifted inside the warehouse, his shoulders rounding, his hand moving downward toward something concealed. The movement was clear now, impossible to miss. Then Ranger moved. The leap was fast, decisive, precise. The impact came exactly as the suspect's fingers brushed the device. The object fell from his grasp, skidding across the concrete floor, catching the light. The suspect collapsed backward, stunned, restrained seconds later by the team. The video did not cut away. It continued, unbroken, showing Ranger standing alert but controlled, showing Hayes's hand steady on the dog's back as the threat was neutralized. When the video ended, no one spoke. The silence was complete, not confusion, not shock, understanding. Ranger lifted his head slightly, sensing the change in the air. He did not move beyond that. He lay quietly, breathing slow, unburdened by the scrutiny surrounding him. Reed allowed the silence to stand before turning toward the judge. "Your Honor," he said calmly, "the defense calls Lucas Bennett." Lucas Bennett approached the witness stand with visible hesitation. He was a slender man in his late 30s, pale under the courtroom lights, his shoulders slightly hunched as if he wished to make himself smaller. His wire-frame glasses sat unevenly on his nose, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. Bennett was not accustomed to attention. He lived comfortably behind screens and servers where truth existed in code rather than confrontation. He took the oath quietly. Reed's voice remained level. "Mr. Bennett, you were responsible for managing and maintaining the body cam data from this operation." "Yes," Bennett replied, barely above a murmur. "The footage just shown," Reed continued, "does it match the original archived file stored within the system?" Bennett swallowed. His eyes flicked briefly toward the prosecution, then back down. "Yes," he said. A ripple moved through the courtroom. Reed nodded once, then asked the question everyone was waiting for. "Was the footage previously presented to this court complete?" Bennett hesitated. The pause stretched, heavy and unmistakable. "No," he said finally. The words seemed to echo. Green rose halfway from his seat. "Objection!" The judge raised a hand. Overruled. Bennett exhaled shakily, as though the truth had been pressing against his chest for too long. "I was instructed to remove the initial segment," he said, "the portion showing the K-9 alert and the suspect's movement prior to contact." "Who instructed you?" Reed asked. Bennett closed his eyes briefly, then opened them. "My supervisor. The direction came from command." A hush fell over the room. "They said the footage would complicate the case," Bennett continued, his voice steadier now. "That it would raise questions about planning and authorization. I was told it was procedural, that it would simplify things." Reed did not press him further. There was nothing left to uncover. Sarah Collins sat near the back of the courtroom, her posture rigid. Tall and slender, her hands gripped the edge of the bench as if anchoring herself. Her dark hair framed a face marked by quiet endurance. Years earlier, she had lived through a moment where truth arrived too late to prevent harm. That experience had sharpened her sensitivity to omission. As the video played, as the confession unfolded, she felt something unfamiliar rise in her chest. Relief. Hayes remained still throughout it all. He did not look toward the jury. He did not react to Bennett's confession. He lowered his gaze instead to Ranger, whose eyes had drifted closed again, peaceful, unconcerned. Hayes felt the tension ease slightly, replaced by a quieter weight. Vindication was never clean. It came carrying echoes of how close everything had come to going wrong. The judge addressed the courtroom, her voice firm, measured. "The court recognizes that the newly presented evidence materially alters the context of this case." Her gaze passed briefly over Hayes, then Ranger. "This evidence will be entered into the record in full." No cheers followed, no raised voices, only silence. But this silence was different. It no longer hid the truth. The courtroom did not erupt when the verdict was read. There was no gasp, no applause, no sudden release of sound. The words traveled calmly across the room, measured and final, as if they had always been waiting to be spoken. Matthew Hayes stood with his hands resting at his sides, shoulders squared, eyes forward. He listened without moving while the judge declared him not guilty, her voice steady, her expression composed. The decision carried weight, not because it was dramatic, but because it was precise. Ranger sat beside him, posture perfect, ears relaxed. The German shepherd did not understand the language of courts or verdicts, but he sensed the change immediately. The tension that had filled the room for weeks loosened. People exhaled, shoulders lowered, even the air seemed to soften. Ranger's tail moved once, slow and deliberate, then stilled again. Matthew did not smile. Relief came to him quietly, like water finding its level. Years of discipline had taught him that emotion did not need display to be real. What mattered was that the truth had been allowed to stand. Across the aisle, Thomas Green remained seated, his posture rigid, but his expression altered. The prosecutor did not argue the ruling. He gathered his papers carefully, the way a man did when he accepted the limits of procedure. Order had been restored, though not in the way he had expected. Green's belief in systems remained intact, but it now carried a visible scar, a reminder that systems could be misused as easily as they could be defended. Michael Reed rose briefly, nodding once to Matthew. There was no handshake, no congratulatory gesture. Reed understood the gravity of what had passed. Vindication was not celebration, it was correction. The judge addressed the matter of Ranger next. Her tone shifted subtly, less formal, though still restrained. She acknowledged the findings presented, the verified footage, the testimony that had reshaped the narrative. She recognized Ranger not as a liability, but as a trained K-9 who had acted in accordance with his conditioning, responding to a threat that no human had confirmed in time. Ranger's service record was restored. His actions were officially classified as protective, justified, and life-saving. The words were read plainly, but their meaning settled deep. Ranger remained still throughout it all, head high, eyes calm. When the judge concluded, he looked up at Matthew as if waiting for direction. Matthew placed a hand lightly on the dog's shoulder, a silent acknowledgement. At the back of the courtroom, Sarah Collins felt tears gather unexpectedly. She had not come prepared for release. Tall and slender, her posture always controlled, she found her hands trembling slightly as she pressed them together. Sarah had lived for years with the memory of truth arriving too late. She had learned to protect herself from hope. Watching justice unfold correctly, without distortion, unsettled her in a way she had not anticipated. She stood slowly as the court adjourned, watching Matthew and Ranger leave together. She did not speak to them. She did not need to. What mattered was that she would carry this moment with her, a reminder that sometimes truth arrived in time. The hallway outside the courtroom filled quietly. Conversations remained low, respectful. No one approached Matthew for comment. No one asked for explanation. He preferred it that way. Ranger walked beside him, matching his pace, their movements synchronized as they had been for years. 2 days later, the ceremony was brief. There was no audience beyond a handful of officials and a few fellow handlers. Ranger stood calmly on the small platform, his coat brushed clean, his service collar polished. He was 7 years old now, strong but seasoned, his muzzle touched faintly with gray. He had earned his retirement not through age alone, but through service completed without compromise. The citation was read. Ranger's record was restored in full. His name cleared. Matthew knelt briefly, adjusting the collar one last time, his hand steady. He did not speak. Ranger leaned forward slightly, pressing his forehead against Matthew's chest, a gesture of familiarity rather than affection. Cameras were absent. The moment belonged only to them. When it ended, Ranger stepped down easily, tail moving once, content. The paperwork for Matthew's separation from service was processed without delay. He did not argue the decision. He had made it himself. His career had been defined by readiness, by the willingness to move where needed. Now he chose stillness. There were no speeches, no farewell gathering. Matthew left quietly, carrying only what mattered. Ranger followed, unburdened by rank or expectation. They traveled north away from the city, to a place where mornings arrived slowly and evenings stretched long. The house was small, set back from the road, bordered by open land that rolled gently toward the horizon. The air there smelled of grass and sun rather than dust and concrete. Ranger adapted quickly. He explored the property with careful interest, nose low, ears attentive. He learned the boundaries within a day, the rhythms within a week. At night he slept deeply for the first time in years, stretched out near the door, content in the absence of alarms. Matthew settled into a different kind of routine. He woke early, not from necessity, but habit. He repaired fences, walked the land, read in the evenings with Ranger lying nearby, head resting on his boots. Silence no longer pressed against him. It accompanied him. Occasionally, Sarah Collins thought of them. She did not know where they had gone. She only knew that the case had ended the way it should have. The memory steadied her in moments when doubt returned, reminding her that truth, though fragile, could still hold. One evening, as the sun dipped low, Matthew stood on the porch, watching Ranger move across the grass, his gait relaxed, unhurried. The dog paused, looking back, waiting as he always had. Matthew smiled then, just once. Honor had been restored, not with noise, but with care. It was enough. Sometimes God's miracles come quietly, when truth is nearly buried and hope feels small. In this story, justice was not won by strength or anger, but by faith, loyalty, and the courage to do what was right when it mattered most. In our daily lives, we face moments when honesty is difficult and silence feels safer. This reminds us that God sees every faithful choice and restores what is lost in His perfect time. If this story spoke to your heart, please share it with others, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel so more uplifting stories can reach those in need. May God bless everyone watching with peace and protection. If you believe, comment Amen below.